In this video, we're looking at a version of the ad hominem fallacy, specifically called the circumstantial ad hominem. You'll see why in just a moment. And in this video, what we're going to do is we'll talk about what the ad hominem circumstantial is. We'll look at the argument structure for the fallacy. We'll talk about what goes wrong, why it's a fallacy, what bad argumentation is occurring here. We'll look at some common situations in which you can expect to see this arising. Then we'll zero in on 3 examples of the fallacy so we can look at some specific applications. We'll talk about some guidelines for how to spot it, or what you should be on guard about. We'll talk, for those of you who are students and need to be able to distinguish this fallacy from other fallacies on quizzes and homework and tests. We'll talk about how not to mix it up with other fallacies. And then we'll finish by talking about how you can be a better critical thinker and avoid falling into this fallacy in your own life. So, what is the fallacy of ad hominem circumstantial? Right? Sometimes it's called appeal to motive. When we talk about somebody having a conflict of interest or a vested interest, this is often what is meant. And what we've got here is a variety of the ad hominem, which is Latin for against the person fallacy. Now, ad hominem in general works by attacking a person who's making a claim so that we can then reject the claim. In this case, we do so by focusing on some sort of circumstances of the person who is making the claim. Something about that person or the situation that they're in or the group that they belong to. And so the claim that's being made by the person is going to be rejected on the basis of calling into question things like their motive or their interest or their biases. And we say, well, those come from their circumstances, or those are their circumstances, so therefore we can reject the claim. If we look at the structure of the fallacy, it's pretty straightforward, and you can see where it goes wrong. A claims X to be true, but A is in circumstance Q. And here's the hidden premise. Here's the thing that everything turns on. People who are in circumstance Q are predisposed towards believing or claiming X when X is not true. And the conclusion then is X is false. So because a person has some sort of reason for believing or putting forth a claim, we say we're not going to believe it, it's no good. If we look at the structure of the fallacy, what we're saying is like the person is in these circumstances, that creates some sort of bias, or however else you want to put it, some sort of motive for making that claim. That's what's leading them to make the claim that X is true, and so we should go to the other extreme and say, no, X is actually false. Now, why is this a fallacy? One thing to bear in mind with every single one of these ad hominem fallacies, a claim can be true independently of the circumstances of the person who's making the claim. If we get a bit more general with it, a claim can be true regardless of who is making the claim. And so there's a confusion that's occurring between several different things. A claim actually being true, that's one thing. Having good reasons to think that a claim is true, that's another thing. And having a motivation for thinking that a claim is true, that's a third thing. If we blur all these together, we're liable to fall into bad reasoning. Now, it's good to keep in mind, it's quite possible for a biased or interested party to still make true claims or provide good justification for claims. It's not the case that bias, and all of us have some sort of bias going on, right? We all have some interests. We all have motivations for things. We belong to particular groups or communities or traditions. That doesn't mean that we're all making claims solely on that basis, and so we shouldn't attribute that to other people as well. Let's look at some common situations. So when does this occur? Like I put here, it's common, and it's understandably common, in situations in which interested or biased parties do tend to make false claims or bad arguments based on their circumstances. There are cases where people do this. So that's going to lead us to say, well, we should be leery of that, but we want to be careful. So what are some of the situations? I'll give you a lot of examples here. Personal relationships and conflicts. You can't be objective because you love them, because you hate them, because you're a rival to them, because they're your kid, because they're your parent, and we can go on and on and on and on, right? Legal cases and arguments. Now, sometimes there are genuine legal conflicts of interest. Same lawyer shouldn't be, representing two parties that have conflicting interests, for example. But oftentimes, people will say things on the stand like, well, this witness says this, but of course they have to say that sort of thing because they belong to that group, or that's the way they see things. So we shouldn't listen to anything that they happen to say. That's an argument ad hominem right there. Purchasing and selling, we've got interested parties when there's economic motives going on, right? Educational settings. Now, education, we often imagine, the K through 12 as being this wonderful place with these people who just love teaching children, and they just have the kids' best interests at heart, and the kids are usually, little devils or little angels. And, the truth is something completely different than that in most cases, isn't it? And there's a lot of, dismissing people's claims based on their circumstances. That goes on in educational settings, whether we're talking about PTA boards or superintendent's decisions or what happens in a classroom, who gets a hall pass. Grading sometimes is affected by that. And college, it works the same way as well. What professors have to say is sometimes dismissed on the basis of, well, you're a professor, you have to say that sort of thing. And oftentimes, the people who are dismissing other people's claims don't even know what a person's genuine circumstances or situation is. Here's a great example. If we professors are saying, that professors should get more governance in educational institutions, that they've been marginalized, that they should be paid better, that sort of thing. Students will often think, well, what are you professors complaining about? I mean, you run the place, don't you? And you're making the bulk of the money. That's why our tuition goes up so much. And, when you point out to them, when you actually show them statistics that shows, no, professors are getting paid less and less because there's more and more adjuncts, and administrators are getting paid more and more. There's a lot more of them. And, less and less of them are coming from the faculty, and more of them are professional administrators and with their staffs. Then the students' eyes are open and they're like, whoa, your circumstances were very different than I thought. Let's go on. Psychotherapy. Sometimes psychotherapists will reject what a client or patient has to say on the basis, well, they have to say that, a very classic case would be if you really buy into the classic Oedipal complex, you got to say that because you're Oedipalized. It's interesting. There's a lot more to be said about that as well. Politics and policymaking. How often do people dismiss what their opponents have to say on the basis of, well, they're just, saying that because they're in the pocket of that lobby there. That's a bad argument. Sports, sports radio included would fit in there. Religious discussions. Aesthetic matters, about, say, what kind of coffee you ought to drink, or is this a good piece of music or a bad piece of music? Is that a good play? Journalism, it occurs within journalism. Sometimes people questioning the sources. Sometimes people, interviewing other people and saying, well, of course he had to say that, right, because of his circumstances. And then, of course, opinion pieces. A lot of this goes on. So you can see that there's a lot of situations in which we can find this. Here's an example: Walmart employees and wages. You can't believe what Representative Brown is saying about Walmart employees going on food stamps. After all, some of her biggest donors are the unions. We all know how they feel about Walmart and how Walmart feels about them. So the conclusion, Walmart employees aren't collecting food stamps from the government based on their income level, which we know is actually false. Walmart employees are indeed in many places collecting food stamps, various forms of welfare, because their wages are low and because they're not given enough hours to be full-time. And this is kind of a national scandal, isn't it? So if we're going to try to dismiss this on the basis of who somebody's donors are, that's an ad hominem argument. The claim can be true regardless of who's taking money from who. The extended warranty. Now, I'm not saying buy extended warranties, by the way. Usually they're a terrible idea, aren't they? But this is a bad argument. No, I don't think you should listen to him at all. He gets paid on commission. So he pretty much has to push the extended warranty, whether it's good for the customer or not. So you should not purchase the extended warranty for the product, is the conclusion. There may be some things for which it does make good sense to purchase an extended warranty. It really depends on a case-by-case basis. And some salespeople, although they are motivated by their commissions, might actually have the customer's interest at heart. I've actually met a few of them from time to time. Here's a third example. The reliability of the canonical Gospels. This is something that comes up every Easter time, isn't it? It's just like that guy on the History Channel said. We can't assume that anything that is in the 4 canonical Gospels is reliable. After all, those guys were all committed Christians already by the time that they started to write things down. How could they not just record what fit their own preconceived beliefs and leave out anything they didn't already agree with? So what's the conclusion? Don't trust anything in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's a bad argument on a couple of points. One is, History Channel. It quit being a History Channel about a decade ago. And so you got to kind of take things with a grain of salt when you see them on there, because they have a tendency to take people from the fringes and present them as reliable scholars. But let's put that aside, right? Is it fair game to say that we can't trust any sort of historical documents because the people who were writing them down had some sort of motive for writing them down, and they wrote them down in that way just to get across their own story? There's 2 real problems with that. One is that this is just a plain ad hominem attack. You don't have any evidence for that to begin with. But the other problem is there are certain traditions in which truthfulness was actually stressed as an important quality. So we should expect that, there'd be some sort of cognitive dissonance in deliberately writing things down that they knew weren't true, right? So that's a problem as well. How do you spot this? Well, pay attention to the uses that are made of ascriptions to other people of bias, interest, or motives, particularly in relation to their claims and arguments. You want to be on guard about that. Pay attention to people who typically judge the truth of claims on the basis of those who make those claims and the circumstances of those people. People who do that are much more likely to fall into this fallacy. So you should be on guard for that. It's sort of like knowing that somebody, has a weakness for smoking or for playing the slots, and then, you see them by the slot machine, better watch them, right? Same thing with this sort of thing. If you know somebody has a track record of falling into this fallacy, pay attention to that. Another thing to keep in mind, often those who readily accuse others of making claims or arguments largely on the basis of bias, self-interest, or emotional motives are prone themselves to engage in that kind of reasoning. Pay attention to people who are constantly accusing others of making biased claims or arguments, because those people tend to be the sort that think that it's all just biased claims and arguments. It's all ideology. We're all just trying to get our point across. And they're liable to fall into it themselves. Now, if you're a student, you want to be able to distinguish this from other ad hominem fallacies. Another one of them is inconsistency. Another fallacy you'll see is guilt by association. Those are not the same thing as circumstantial. Inconsistency, you're saying that somebody is somehow contradicting themselves, or they're not sticking to the the script, you might say. With guilt by association, you're saying that because a person belongs to a group or is with other people who've made this particular claim, or who generally do things that are bad or false, we're going to not rely on them. We're going to dismiss their claims. Another thing to keep in mind, ad hominem fallacies are often confused with straw man fallacies. In a straw man fallacy, the emphasis is placed on the argument that the person is making. You distort the argument so that you can reject the claim of their argument. You're not actually attacking the person. In an ad hominem fallacy, you are attacking the person who's making the claim and saying there's some sort of, in this case, there's some sort of circumstance that person is in which provides us reasons for rejecting their claim. Now, not every argument that focuses on the circumstances of the opponent is necessarily a fallacious argument. If you can provide some reason why what you're mentioning is actually relevant to the claim, then it may not be a fallacy. So let's talk now about how you can avoid falling into this. How can you be a better critical thinker? Well, one thing is avoid uncritically ascribing bias, interest, or other motivations for taking a position to a person as something that inevitably clouds their judgment or skews their position. If you do that, you have a very, very low view of human nature, and it applies equally to you. It's quite possible to have a bias and also to overcome the bias. So it doesn't provide, an automatic get out of an argument free card to you when you're running into somebody else. Acknowledge biases or interests that people may have arising from their circumstances, but remind yourself, and you have to do this as an activity, remind yourself that even biased or interested parties can make true claims. A person could be wanting you to get the extended warranty because, they want to sell extended warranties, but it might actually be a good thing for you in this case. Your doctor might be taking bribes to tell you that you have cancer, but you actually do have cancer, right? So, make sure that you remind yourself that the truth of something is independent of who's making the claim. Now, if you suspect that a person is indeed being misled or misleading others because of biases or interests, see whether you can provide some sort of independent good reasons for rejecting their claims. Don't just say, well, they're biased, so we reject their claims. See if you can provide some other sort of reason to reject their claims. Also, pay close attention to your own circumstances and their effects on your motivations for believing or making claims. Do they inevitably sway you? If you don't think that they do, if you think you have some sort of control over the claims that you make and the ways that your interests or your biases affect you, what about other people? Shouldn't you apply the same criterion to other people as well? Last thing I'm going to say, this video is part of a series that's discussing common fallacies in reasoning and argument, and it belongs to a channel that's devoted specifically to critical thinking, logic, and argumentation. So if you enjoy the video, if you found it useful, if you think other people might find it useful as well, share it on your social media and come back to the channel because we're going to be constantly posting new material for months and years to come.